day.
Okay, the Thursday, September 21st meeting of the Water Quality Management Committee will come to order. First item on, well, before I get into the agenda, I'd like to recognize Miriam Cronin from the League of Women Voters. And we're also joined by Paul Dreyer from the Falmouth Planning Board. Welcome. First item on the agenda, the draft scenario for achieving TMDL compliance in Quistit Harbor, Watershed.
Well, as we've been going through these, we have a fairly common.
Can she get the mic?
Oh, there you go. Turn it, that should be fine. Yeah? I think it ought to pick me up there. So going down the west coast, for those who haven't been tuning in every week, we've started with Megansett Harbor, which is our northernmost estuary, working our way down. We've done Rands and Fiddlers and Megansett. And we did a little leapfrog over Wild Harbor to get some additional data. And so here we are today talking about Quistit. And you're all familiar, I believe, with Quistit. This is the harbor here. And this is the inner harbor from where the National Academy of Sciences goes to Kerry Lane. And the outer harbor has features such as the Woods Hole Golf Club, which shows up quite readily in the aerial photograph. We have Sentinel Stations and other monitoring stations. The QH 1, 2, and 3 are the monitoring stations that SMAST goes out every other week in the summer. And then the red arrow, which doesn't show up as nicely as I'd like it to, delineates QH2, which is our Sentinel Station. The watershed looks like this, like a teardrop. Kind of reminds me of Oyster Pond in the shape of the watershed. And I want us all to pay attention to, this is the inner harbor, this particular little sub-watershed, this smaller teardrop. And this part of the watershed is the outer harbor. And that's going to come up next, because Steve Layton, when we were talking about Megansett, really made a very apt observation that the concentration of nitrogen tends to be higher in certain parts of this harbor, or any of the harbors we looked at. And in QH2, it's really stunning and quite noteworthy that the inner harbor, which again, let me orient folks, this is the National Academy of Sciences, and this goes up to Kerry Lane. It is really just the inner harbor that has impairment. And so I'm just going to go back to one, if you look at the watershed, and then you look at the impairment, it's pretty clear that the inner harbor is where the focus ought to be. And this again is reflected by SMAST in the MEP report, where they show no removal required for what they call the main part of the harbor, but I like to call the outer harbor, because that's what everybody who hangs out in Quistit calls it, and the upper harbor, or what we would call the inner harbor. So even here, SMAST is sort of prescribing or recommending that the work be done in the inner harbor. So what do we get? So how big is the problem? Well, in Quistit, it's pretty similar. It is similar to every other harbor we looked at. Most of the problems coming from septic systems, 84% in this case. And there are two other sort of interesting features. One is they've got a golf course load here at 3%, and then stormwater at 8%, and fertilizer that's not from the golf course as 5%. So if we do our math, like we always do, the target for the inner harbor is 266 kilograms, which when you start looking at what we've been looking at in some watersheds is thousands and thousands. This is sort of, I want to say it's like shooting fish in a barrel, but I'm not actually sure it's that easy to shoot fish in a barrel. So it's a much easier target to get our brains around.
Yeah, we don't shoot fish.
We don't shoot fish. You know the expression, right? It's as easy as, it's got to be a good analogy for something that's really easy, for getting less than 300 kilograms out of an estuary. So the first scenario is a shellfish scenario, where we've got the target of 266 kilogram. Fertilizer gets us 17, stormwater gets us 24, and as the board may remember, we spent a lot of time doing field work for the fertilizer bylaw, or the nitrogen control bylaw for fertilizer, a few short years ago. And one of the things we did is we actually met with the Woods Hole Golf Club. And it was really quite, here's Ron, hi Ron.
Hi, Rob.
It was really quite astounding that they manage their fertilizer applications as precisely as they do. They talked about spoon feeding the tees and not fertilizing the roughs and making sure they use as little fertilizer as possible so they don't get fungus and other problems in their turf. So imagining that we could take 25% of what the golf course load was seems pretty reasonable to us, we thought, because we have a fertilizer bylaw and we've actually seen the real world situation as opposed to some theoretical, what do golf courses do. So this first scenario.
So that should say 25% after golf course, the same way it does after fertilizer?
No, we took all of the golf course because from our meetings with the golf course, they do not put fertilizer that's going to run off into the harbor on the grass. Their management strategy is only put enough fertilizer on in ways that the uptake will come from.
But they've already done
Sure.
it.
Yes, they have done that, but SMAS counted 32 kilograms as coming from there. They didn't measure anything.
But then that means that it's coming from somewhere else.
Or it's
Because
not
they
coming at all.
normalize their models to the measured concentration at the Sentinel Station.
I don't think that's necessarily true.
But it could be, right?
It could be.
There's also a time differential, the time that the Quistit study was done versus the time you had the conversation.
Oh, yeah, it was years later that we had
Like
the
almost a
conversations.
decade.
But I think Steve is saying something different. He's saying.
I know he is.
But,
Yeah.
well, but what
I-
Virginia's saying is relevant too.
It
I mean,
might
the
be.
Yeah.
two both have to be checked on.
Yeah.
Or else it's
So-
meaningless.
So the
Yeah.
check on what Virginia said is yes, they counted fertilizer before we had a fertilizer bylaw that would have removed it. And that's why we're taking credit at 25%.
But it's not the bylaw, it's when the golf course decided to do it, which could have been way before the bylaw.
May or may not have been. But what the MEP report did not do is go to the golf course and find out what they were doing. They took an estimate of all kinds of golf courses. So can we hold questions? Can we-
Yeah,
I think it's more
Sorry.
productive to get through it and then to go back. So anyway, we've got our typical stormwater and fertilizer, and then we have a target of 194 kilograms, which is what the target is minus fertilizer and stormwater credits that we're taking. And so based on our conversation for the Rand's Fiddler's watersheds, we counted denitrification. And so it's pretty straightforward, 129 kilograms of uptake and then half of that for denitrification that can get the 194 kilograms, which is the target after stormwater and fertilizer. 129 kilograms is about 1 million shellfish, and I put a note that just says it could include either gear-based aquaculture or cohog bottom planting or some combination of the two. But those numbers and that quantity is not, it's a fairly easy target. And when we did the aquaculture plan, we actually not put out an area in Quistit that could do about that. So the aquaculture has sort of been field verified. There's one more scenario. So this is the shellfish. Scenario 1 is the shellfish scenario. Scenario 2, again, does the same for fertilizer, stormwater, and the golf course, but figured how many IA systems it would take to do the same, and it's 40. The methodology for that had to do with taking the MEP water use, multiplying it by the wastewater coefficient from the MEP, taking 74% removal, which is the 10 milligrams versus that should say 39, that's a typo, but getting the removal rates that are calculated this way. And if we look at a picture, this is 40 properties, it's actually 41 properties, and it's pretty much all it's definitely in the upper watershed, which is the part that I'm just going to go back to because Ron wasn't here for it. As you'll see, this is the upper watershed, and from MEP, first from the nitrogen concentration contour plot, and then from the MEP, that's where the removal should be. So from an IA perspective, it's a pretty doable scenario to get those numbers at 10 milligrams per liter from the upper watershed. So again, these are starting points, and there are two different scenarios, but as you did last time, we had a discussion and you thought there could be modifications, and then we can make modifications to these. So with that, I'm now going to go sit back so I can take notes. Run back and forth if I have to move. Is there any slide I should go to right away before I sit back down?
I don't think I need the slides.
Okay.
Okay, Steve?
Two totally different things. First, on this one, you obviously picked the number of shellfish to come out to an amount of nitrogen that exactly works. And you said it's a modest amount. So that means even if the fertilizer in the golf course and the stormwater didn't work, you could probably increase the shellfish to take care of the whole thing. Is that correct? Okay.
And that would be true if the denitrification didn't work. You just add more shellfish.
Right, right. And then the other one was about the other slide, but you don't have to show the slide. But you pointed out that their water use is higher.
Yes.
But you didn't use that, I hope, to come up with a conclusion that therefore each IA system will remove more nitrogen. Because they could easily be eating the same amount of food and putting out the same amount of nitrogen, because they're people. But they're rich people, so they might be using more water for pools or bird baths or lawn watering or something, which has nothing to do with the nitrogen.
The MEP report calculated the load going into the estuary based on water use. So they base it on water use, and they take 90% of it. So I followed the same methodology as the MEP report because we have to be internally consistent with our counting of kilograms. So
I hear you, but do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah, but I'm saying, yes, we did. We used 200. That's why we used that. That's why I showed you the methodology. If we decided we wanted to use 80% of water use because we think people in Quistit have swimming pools and wash down their cars and boats more frequently than people in East Falmouth, we could. I think it's more a function of more people during the summer months than it is more washing of boats. People in Quistit don't wash their boats in their yards.
Yeah,
John?
So, see, if we think about the shellfish thing, I mean, on that aquaculture committee, when we've talked about shellfish in Quistit, we've basically talked about a grant in the outer harbor off the National Academy, not in the inner harbor.
It's right on the border. I'm going to show you this. It's a good point, and actually it's very interesting
So
how it worked out.
ultimately, we've got to get that Sentinel Station down.
And I'm going to show you where the grant is relative to the place where the grant is, because this is also the line of the open and closed, or the conditional and the closed part of Quistit. The nursery part is here.
See, you had an early slide that was an aerial view that showed the Sentinel Station.
Like that better? Sentinel Station is in here. There is no place to put shellfish. We actually both, before the aquaculture plan and during the aquaculture plan, did a bunch of field visits and whatnot to try and see if this area in here on Quistit Harbor Road along the seawall would support shellfish and gear. And the answer is really not. If you look at that place in some, we actually put 2 bags out near the dock there, the Quistit Yacht Club dock, or the Land Trust dock, and kids would swim out to it and flip it around and look at it, and that area is way too populated and people are way too excited and curious in the summer to put gear. I mean, unless you put big signs in front of it, but there also isn't space.
There isn't space.
And there's really no space. So the Shellfish Scenario is looking here and actually in here around Disappearing Island for the uptake. And that's where it is. And if the shellfish have to be right on top of where the Sentinel Station is to work, I don't think that's a good strategy to be pursuing. I think you want to be in, as close to the land-based sources as possible. But the watershed actually goes past. This is trying to think. sorry. Woods Hole Road.
Quistit Avenue.
Yeah, this is Quistit Avenue, this is, well, this is Woods Hole
Well,
Road.
it becomes
It's in
Sequoia.
28. And that's very much part of the watershed that's going into this part of Quistit, where we're talking about the shellfish. So it's not right on top of the Sentinel Station.
But I think John has a really good point. I mean, obviously, we've all joked over the years about putting the oysters or something else
On
right
top.
around the Sentinel Station. That's obviously cheating and won't work. But it's got to be in the area where the nitrogen is.
It's in the, I'm saying that the
Or else, it's probably a quantitative thing, right? In other words, if it's out by the National Academy, maybe you need twice as many oysters to get the effect.
and we won't know that until we do
back
it.
where you, right.
And, or may not, or denitrification may affect the whole area. But the point is that it's in the inner harbor, and the grow-out area is in the outer harbor. So the nursery, which is where you get your most bang for your buck in terms of biomass increase over a season per square foot, so that's the important quantity for understanding nitrogen uptake, biomass increase per season, per square meter, or whatever you want to call it, is in the inner harbor. And the less dense second-year growth happens in the outer harbor. And the million that we were talking about, I was envisioning, we're not really getting into the implementation details at this level.
Well, you
But if
have
we
another
would-
scenario.
but if we
You have the
would-
IA scenario, so it's no big deal.
And then
but-
there's another scenario, yeah.
Right.
Thanks, Eric. Thanks for coming back. See you. Sorry, it was a little late. One thing, a couple points that were made. One is that I won't start with shellfish, but in the summer months, there are more people and therefore there's more of an impact. But the thing is that depending on where the houses are and how far over they are from the shoreline, what happens in the summer may show up in the spring. In other words, the groundwater flow rate of, if it's septic or whatever else is coming in, there is a delay of time. So it isn't like summer is summer. It actually may be that the summer load that's coming in would be coming in during a relatively low, for many of the houses, not the ones right on the shore, but for many of them, there's a delay. And so it may not be directly there. The other thing is these ones right along the shore, that's going to be days, if less, whatever, but further away it's going to be longer, some longer time to migrate in. So it's just something to think about from a modeling perspective. And then with the shellfish, I think that we'll talk more about this later, but Eric and I and Tom went out on a field trip with Chuck on Thursday, and one thing that he's thinking about that we actually talked about a long time ago and somewhat being implemented in Little Pond now was that to put the shellfish possibly along the edges of the estuaries so that you would be near the shore. And there's two things about that. One is that it's right in where the nutrients are coming in, if that it has a possibility for rapid phytoplankton bloom there maybe. But the other is the site aspects, and that if it's across the harbor, it's against the other side, you can't see much of it. There may be appropriate places, like there are appropriate places for PRBs and there are not appropriate places. So there could be areas where long strips could be done, say along the edge of the harbor in different places, and those people on the side where they are would be looking over them more or less and seeing the other side and whatever. So there's a site thing that's aspect there. And so how it's going to be laid out ultimately is something that we'll be moving toward, I think, gradually, in figuring out where to place it and how to make it work best. And then the third aspect that I'd like to mention is about going back to the golf course. I mean, I think that, as I recall, even during the cranberry period, where there was a lot of discussion about the cranberry bogs and there's still about pollution and stuff, and they kept talking about, the growers were saying they only use so much fertilizer because they don't want to lose it, and they don't want to over-fertilize, and they want to maximize uptake by the plants. And I think golf courses have been doing that for some time. And it could be that what Steve is saying and that Virginia is saying is that estimate of the 25% may actually be already done, and there may even be more restrictive usage than even the bylaw calls for the golf courses. So I agree that we need to find out from the golf course really what their practice has been. And they must have records of purchasing fertilizer for years and years. So that kind of thing could help answer some of those questions about the 1,000 square feet, how many pounds, was it 2 pounds or something, was 1 pound per year. So.
Two points or questions, I guess. The golf course piece, while interesting, is sort of irrelevant because if any of their nitrogen is getting into the harbor, it isn't impairing the harbor.
Well,
It's the outer harbor.
The outer harbor is fine
Yeah.
with the golf course contribution.
Very good point.
Coming, so we're not going to worry about it.
But we're including it in the
but
calculation.
we did take credit for it
Yes.
when we made our target number
Right.
of how
So
many
we could just-
IAs or
so-
something.
So we could remove it.
We should
we
just
could
take it
remove
away.
it.
That's
Yeah,
right.
maybe not.
To be,
All right, so I'm just going to write remove golf course.
yeah.
My other
That's a
question
good
would be, this study that the town Shellfish Working Group has been doing, could you tell us in a little more detail exactly where they proposed putting what and in what quantity that they thought this water body could support?
I can. I don't remember the exact numbers. I'd have to look up, which if
Off the top of your head,
off the top of my, well, around the national account, but exactly right.
yeah, you had that one spot for the incubation, so to speak.
Nursery.
Just as a point of that, you
Let
mentioned,
me answer his question. So his question was where? And, look what I
I
just
pronounced, what was it, 290 kilograms was it total for the?
Like I
shellfish?
said, I don't have a number off the
No,
top
you
of
had
my
it up
head.
on the.
It might have been 266.
Plus 40, plus, I don't know,
I'm
where's
gonna
the
go back.
the number?
I'm gonna go back to the numbers.
Yeah, okay.
Let me just-
all right. I know, but
266.
just qualify.
That's the full, 194 kilograms was the target for shellfish. The location that we came up with, and I'm going to use the aerial photograph from the aquaculture plan, which was really an estimate, and the locations were really preliminary. The idea of the nursery here around what we call Disappearing Island, and then here as exactly along the shore. You know, the MAS has had this paradigm for several years, if not longer, probably in the past 3 years anyway, of hugging their bags along the shore. And that is the vision for this National Academy of Sciences area, to have them hugging the shore because nobody will see them and they'll stay out of the navigation channel.
Fine.
And then this area, just, you can't really ribbon stuff because the boats are so
Right.
tight to the shore already. So we went sort of around and near
Right.
Disappearing Island.
So these are in bags.
And it's all floating, or rack and bag systems,
Okay,
if
but
that's
it's
what
not
the
on the ground,
grower.
obviously.
Pardon?
It's not on the bottom.
Not bottom, no,
Okay.
absolutely no bottom planting. We
Okay.
bottom planted exactly in this
Right.
area and
Didn't-
this area 5 years ago when Matt Weeks was with us.
Didn't
and
work.
It didn't work,
Okay.
right.
In terms of quantity, was there a sense of?
Yeah, we had a quantity, I'm just gonna look it up.
I think it's about 4, it looks like, I just did it back of the envelope, about 4 million.
4 million?
No, no. I'm gonna look it up because I have my computer here and I can look it up because
24 to 5 grams each.
open. I will tell you. Give me a second. Gonna get to the end of it. Yeah, here we go.
Oh, no, sorry.
From the aquaculture plan. Such a big plan. Oh, there it is. Okay, so what we had for Quissit is about 500,000 oysters being grown and 500,000 quahogs being bottom planted. So this is,
Bottom planted?
I mean, quahogs, yes, quahogs bottom planted because quahogs don't grow, quahogs grow really well here in this soil. Oysters grow on top.
Okay, so the
Quahogs grow
failure was
in.
the oysters
That's right.
that were bottom
And there's
planted.
been success, there's people quahog here, there's quite a reasonable population of quahogs. And our number is higher, but it certainly could be accommodated.
You're taking into account the change in the number of quahogs,
Yes,
the increase over the.
yes, absolutely. It wouldn't be counting the quahogs that are already there, keeping the water quality at its baseline. It'd be an addition. But again, I don't think we're trying to get into the stage of implementation with each of these scenarios. So you'd have to go back and look and say, all right, maybe we'd have to put additional racks, and bags other places to accommodate the number, or maybe denitrification is 100% and you wouldn't need as many. I mean, there's a lot of different ground truthing that would need to be done before this was a TM, a targeted watershed plan. But it's just a sense of, 194 kilograms is about 1 million animals.
Okay, what I'm seeing here is that this harbor could be addressed solely with shellfish.
That's what we're thinking.
And that's
Yeah.
I'm not quite as optimistic, frankly.
I'm-
And it's
48
not 194, it's 194 plus 32.
Now it is.
It is now, right, so, okay.
If you don't want to take the credit.
I don't see
for
it
the
at all. It
golfers.
looks to me like they'd be cleaning up the
Outer harbor.
as it goes into the outer harbor where it doesn't need to be cleaned up.
So that is a very interesting phenomenon, and I guess point, that those of us who have been doing shellfish planning and implementation in other towns have not focused only on the part of the water body that is
The worst.
the worst, necessarily. I mean, in Orleans, Lonnie's Pond is a terminal pond, so it is getting it at one of the worst areas, but we're not looking at the worst part of the pond. So the idea that there's circulation and mixing, I mean, it's not, I wouldn't jump to the conclusion and then hold on to it with both hands that you have to be in the inner part of the inner harbor for the filtering effect of oysters to have a benefit to water quality. I think that's a
But I hope you would
hypothesis.
equally not hold on to the opposite approach.
Right, but I don't think I would lean to one or the other. I don't think it matters, because there's tidal mixing in these places that happens,
Yeah, but
Every
that
6
can
hours.
that can argue the other way, that you have all this mixing, especially in the outer harbor and up in there, and it's still not taking care of the head of the harbor.
but it's only 260, and it's green, not
No,
red.
but it's all the mixing that's there, that's not going to change,
Right,
is still leaving you with the problem at the head of the harbor. So if
Right.
you clean it up halfway up, it's not clear to me that you make a whole lot of difference at the head of the harbor.
but I'm not sure either way.
But yeah, it's an empirical thing.
Yeah.
Try it.
And I think we know, and I think it's a good question, that what we would do is put a bunch of oysters in to a harbor like this, which is much more wide open than the other places we're doing the experiments, and see if 1 million animals actually did a dent. But I can say unequivocally, where Oyster Pond, Quistit Harbor Road goes around the inner part of the harbor, that would be a very difficult place. You'd have to really patrol it and cordon it off. There's so much foot traffic in the summer, and there's so much interest that it could be done, but there would have to be a very regular, I mean, there's a guard that watches Kerry Lane. That guard would probably have to get paid to make sure people didn't go near the gear, because they would. Lots of kids play in the inner harbor, they walk along it, I think it would be, it's sort of an, it's almost, I don't want to call it urban, because I hate using that word where Falmouth is concerned, but it's significantly more traffic than a whole bunch of other areas. So the practical place to grow shellfish is at the dividing line between the inner and the outer harbor. I mean, just from feasibility and practicality and
Yeah, but there's
attractive
there's a
nuisance.
famous joke about the guy looking for his keys under the streetlight. The person asked him why he wasn't there. He said, well,
I can
I
see
actually
here.
lost them down the other place, but this is where I can see.
One other thing is that there is a movement of, because you have freshwater inflow, there is a movement going out and then going back and forth. There could be more capture going on in the mid-range than you may assume.
Well, I think the take-home lesson is the 40 AAs will probably work like gangbusters. The oysters are a bit of a stretch.
Sure.
If we could grow oysters around the Sentinel Station, yippee, but we can't, so.
Well, the good news is we're thinking about putting grants in anyway, and so you'd be able to run your
They're not
demo.
going to hurt.
Yeah, it's certainly not going to
They're just
hurt.
not going to get us to the TMDL.
But what about the cohogs? What if the cohogs are concentrated up in that area?
Yeah,
That's true.
And then the oysters in another area? I mean, then we're using it strategically, the aquaculture.
Yeah,
But this
Give it a try.
This harbor has kind of a strange bottom in that it gets real deep. It's not like some of these others where you can go and
Yeah.
harvest these things for quite a distance off from shore. I have a feeling if you walk too far off the shore here, you're going to be in very deep water
yes, you get into 15, 16 feet,
because it's a...
about 4 feet, about 10 feet out.
So the location for burying,
But I think Ron's suggestion that you could intensively do quahog planting in our harbor is a very good one. What I can do is I can, I'm just writing myself a note, calculate the area, because I know what quahog densities can be planted,
Right.
and think about it. I think that was a good point, Ron.
right? So if when we move further on this, we're going to have to coordinate with the Shellfish Working Group
And MES.
and MES and get real locations that are supportable.
Right.
Okay. Any further observations on the Quistit Harbor?
Okay, so you'll redo the graph with the table. I'm sorry.
Okay, yep. I'm going to remove, so what I'm going to do for Quistit, this is when taking notes. I'm going to calculate the area of the inner harbor for quahogs,
Right.
and I'm going to remove the golf course.
The golf course, right.
Okay?
Perhaps as a planning exercise, we could think about if you had a rule that said everybody within 300 feet put in an IA, what our gain would be from that and how much shellfish you'd have to add to that
So a hybrid approach.
to make that feasible. 300 feet seems to have some resonance.
Okay, I have a question on that. Would it be 300 feet of the residences in the inner harbor only, since you took away the golf course, which is in the outer harbor? It would only be the residences in the inner harbor.
Be those ones that you had the line around, the 40.
Yep. But just those first waterfront homes? Because that's the 300 feet.
Well, you certainly want the 300 feet within the inner harbor.
But if you're going to take credit for the outer harbor, then I'm putting
How many houses of park do you get with 300 feet in just the inner?
Well,
You can just-
that
you can-
was the rest of my sentence.
We
You
can
have to
count.
go out to Quistit Avenue in order to get the total of 40 to get enough nitrogen removal.
We can just
So
about-
that's more than 300
This
feet.
is a really good one. Well,
I had a picture of that.
That's a good one to count.
So you can
So
see.
You got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12.
Right, because 300 feet is just one row of
There's
houses.
one more
Right.
houses. They'll call it 15. So it's, that might be a really good hybrid strategy to include the shellfish. And that 35, say, 3 is what you get. That basically takes care of the golf course. Just saying. I mean, as a back of the envelope.
Well, we also want to think strategically of where do you phase these things? Is any of this a demonstration project?
Sort of like the West Falmouth
The-
demonstration project?
Well, I mean, the overall approach, is it going to be done such that you have a chance to know whether anything you did any good? If you do two things at once, you don't know which one is actually causing the good effect.
Rules of
And
experimentation.
there's investment angles and risk and a whole lot of consideration.
The answer to your question, I think, is no. If we were going to tell everybody within 300 feet to put in an IA, that's not a demonstration project anymore.
But
The
right.
demonstration project was to find out if IAs work.
Right,
and
but
how
for
they
instance,
work.
You're right.
I don't want to start a big argument about shellfish, but I personally, in the years of being, maybe because I don't care about shellfish, have never seen a conclusive study in any harbor here in Falmouth that shows that Falmouth changed the nitrogen concentration.
That shellfish changed.
The shellfish, yeah.
Changed the
I've
nitrogen
never
content.
seen one. So it would be an obvious thing to at least do that as a, maybe demonstration project has connotations that you don't want, but as an experiment.
Actually, we haven't seen it from anything yet.
In a big
We
way.
haven't seen it from anything yet.
Yeah, but the town of
I haven't seen it from sewers either. Ha!
Right, exactly. We're not-
But we certainly have no objection to MES expanding the areas that it's planting shellfish, which might include Quistit, and they could do that next year if they wanted to.
Yeah, it seems like an ideal place to be high on the list.
Okay.
I think we've done Quistit.
Wait.
I think it's really easy. When we're doing these scenarios, it's really easy to want to take the next step and want to implement something, improve everything. I would recommend we look at these as windshield surveys
Yep.
and desktop analyses for this point, because if we jump on something for Quistit without having gone through all of our other watersheds, we may find that we have a higher priority for something
that's
else
true.
we want to do. So I would just say,
And clearly, we agree you can do Quistit without sewers.
yes, and that's really the point of the exercise
Right.
at some level. It's
Got
to
it.
see where we don't need to have sewer,
Right.
either with IAs or with other non-traditional alternatives.
Perfect.
So, but I do think we should get through all of them if we
Yep.
were going to.
We're going to
Yeah.
do that. Review revisions to draft scenario for achieving TMDL compliance in Rands and Fiddlers watershed. We looked at these in the past. We had made some comments, and
Yep, this is
Here it
your
comes.
comments when we reviewed. I'm not going to re-review it because we just did it last week. I'm just going to talk to you about another scenario. Ron, I think, had suggested we call them scenarios. So this was the first one that was the shellfish scenario. And then, what did I do here? I changed the scenario based on including shellfish uptake as well as denitrification. So the things you asked me to do was to include denitrification and talk about growing methods in the footnote of the table. And so it turned out that to get these target numbers in Rands, you need 2.3 million shellfish, and in Fiddlers, 1.3 million. If you do it with uptake and you give yourself 50% credit for denitrification. And that was my understanding of what we were looking at. So just, here's a look at the numbers as a shellfish scenario. The other scenario was an IA scenario. So it's sort of like Quistit had both the shellfish scenario and the IA. We kind of did the same thing for Rands and Fiddlers. Here's the IA scenario, and with a modest amount of shellfish that accounts for the grant, the aquaculture license that's already being given, but this would be if it were all shellfish, and that's what it looks like.
Can you go back to the IA one for a second? So you could easily do that with zero shellfish too?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah,
So it's safe.
yeah. But there is a grant, an aquaculture license site going in, so we're
But
just
if
taking.
something goes wrong, you could do it with all of
You
that.
could do with all IAs, yeah. And it was just a, I think it's good, then we'll kind of, I don't know, put a ball on each of these as a windshield survey and see where we're at when we get to all of them. Very brief, just wanted to show you we did it.
great.
And that's done.
Any comments, discussion, questions? Thank you. Bourne's Pond Inlet opening update. Virginia.
Okay, just to keep the committee abreast of where we are. Last Friday's Enterprise carried a legal ad, so the plans have been filed with 2 more agencies. They are, the licenses we're looking for are what's called a Chapter 91 license and a 401 water quality certificate. So they've been filed with Waterways, and it's basically under DEP. These are DEP type licenses. Each of these filings has a comment period, and we don't know whether the abutters that appealed the decision of the Conservation Commission, its order of conditions, we don't know whether they will make comment on these or not, but there's a 21-day period where they may do something. The second is regarding the appeal of the Conservation Commission's order of conditions. The last time I briefed you, there had been a site visit followed by a meeting of technical staff from both sides, the town side and the abutters. And at that meeting, which was in early August, right. They asked for some information. Yes, it was August 23rd. That information was provided on August 30th, and it was discussed that they would meet again last week. But instead, last week, they asked for more information, we felt we'd already submitted it, but we submitted it. And we have not heard anything since then. So we're sort of balls in their court, but time is sort of ticking, and I think we're beginning to feel a little frustrated that they're not responding very promptly.
Any comments, questions, observations about that? Okay, a report of members and staff. We took a vote, right?
Yeah.
Oh, yes, how did that go?
Oh, it was fun.
Oh, I'm sure of that.
No, it's good. It was actually a very interesting visit, because we looked at basically 3 areas.
In Bourne's
In
Pond.
Borden's Pond, to look at where the, in terms of the shellfish and the growth of ulva, the sea lettuce, on the on oysters, but in particular, we're basically looking at the oyster sites. And at the first site that we visited, well, the sites were, the first site we visited had like 3-inch oysters, and there was a lot of ulva there, so it was like great growth, 3+ inches, because the 3 inches was back in August, so now they've grown somewhat more. And that looked pretty good. There was, the ulva was there, and on the oysters, but easily removed, and they looked great. Then we went to another site. Now this site was basically sort of mid-pond. It was quite shallow. It was low tide, and it was quite shallow, and was about the middle of Bourne's Pond, for that point at the southern, that point in the southern part. Then we went further upstream to another site. It was right next to the shore on one side where there were houses, and that area had oysters planted and ulva and other seaweed growing on them, as it was in the other area, and they were smaller. So they appeared to be affected. Now, whether they were affected by the ulva or maybe freshwater flow in or something, whatever it might have been, whatever it wasn't clear what it was, because of the one place they were big and one place they were small, and they seemed to have the same issue. Then we said, well, let's see, is there another place we could see where there wasn't any oyster planting, to see what was there? And we went there, and there was indeed ulva, sea lettuce, and this other seaweed as well. Maybe not as much, because there wasn't as much substrate, but there were some large, seemingly looked similar in a way, but maybe not as dense. So to what extent this has an impact on oyster growth, it wasn't completely clear from what we were seeing, and whether the oysters really became the main vector in a sense for encouraging sea lettuce growth. Maybe it was more because there was more substrate, but maybe not that much more. We don't know. I think the studies that are going on now with SMAST, from what Chuck Martin said, he was great about meeting us there. He had a boat, he had everything organized, and was very, very open to looking at everything. But SMAST is the School for Marine Science and Technology at UMass Dartmouth, is doing the study there to look at biota as well as water quality. And the water quality wasn't done this year, but they've been collecting data on it. One thing that Chuck was concerned about, he said that the soft-shell clams were like the canary in the mine, okay, in terms of impacts, okay. And he said that he was concerned that the oysters may be affecting soft-shell clams, but this will be coming out with I think with the SMAS studies. So it was interesting in that we have enough of diversity in terms of impact areas or non-impact areas to see kind of a gradient, maybe to some extent. And it gave another important lesson, is that, as with Quistit Harbor's case, was that maybe there's some areas, even though it looks the same from the surface, that are better for oyster or shellfish production than others. And so therefore, even those are factors that have to be considered in the arrangement. He also showed us the nursery there, where they have the bags, and they're growing the the seed for planting or for next summer's grow out. And the point he pointed out was that, look, you see, they're over there. You see where those sticks are, and you could barely make it out because it was right along the shore. So it was like almost completely masked in terms of the visual impact in that area. So that was another aspect about where to put them and the thinking about planning development as we move along with this. So I think we've got some good information, some good comparative sites that we looked at, and nothing definitive, but clearly there were indications of certain factors. So.
And that Ulva didn't look like it was going to be a severe limiting factor.
It didn't with the one area, but in the other area, we don't know how much of a factor it was because we don't know what.
Inconclusive.
It could have been the other way around too. It
Yeah.
could have been that was better. It's only because Ulva was in both, and the growth was in both, but one had smaller oysters, one had bigger.
They were planted at the same time?
Yeah,
Yep.
it was all the same seeding, same batch, same group, same. I don't know if Eric has.
Speaking as the non-scientist on this tour, I was appalled by the ulva and how it was everywhere. I mean, ulva, for everyone who doesn't know, is this sort of green,
Bright green.
slimy, lettucey looking thing. But it was all over that water body, and I can see why the neighborhood is horrified. Because we're getting to the point where not only are the species we want not doing well, but the species we don't want are doing very well.
Yes.
And that is an example of that.
But you know what's interesting too about that is that C and I went out with Matt Weeks a while ago. And we went to this area that we went where the big oysters were, and there wasn't any over there at that time. It was very clear. It was an open space.
Yeah.
And when I lived on Deep Pond in Hatchville, I lived in Lily Pond, which locals had a different name for it, but anyway, Lily Pond. And it was fascinating because we got a bulrush growth in the pond that I thought was just going to wipe the whole thing out, just completely overgrow it because of development, nutrients, and all this stuff. And it was developing, and it was there. And then it vanished. So it was like the water was clear again, and that impact was no longer there. It was just gone. So there can be these seasonal, year-to-year kinds of things that happen. And so maybe, I don't recall when we went out whether there was much ulva around.
No, there
Anywhere.
really wasn't.
Anywhere.
No.
We were finding oysters that were this big, actually.
Up in
Lawrence
Israel's
Pond.
Cove,
Huh?
right, in Israel's Cove.
Yeah, they were
Yeah.
huge, just there, but that was not many, but they were there. But it's hard to know. The important thing, though, is whether the planting is affecting the biota, but from what we saw, it was inconclusive, I would say. There was some indication, but it wasn't completely clear. And to see it everywhere, as Eric said, and it was kind of building up on the shore quite a bit. I mean, it was sort of like the feeling you're getting from Mill Pond, I guess, in East Falmouth. This year, I went by there, it was pretty bad, Mill Pond.
It's pretty covered.
It was really covered. Anyway, that's
Any other comments or reports?
Only that, ulva is usually a classic indicator of groundwater seeps.
Yes.
So you can walk along the beach and you'll see where there's a groundwater coming in, and there'll be a big growth of ulva, and then nothing on either side of it. The fact that we're now getting it overspreading is a little concerning.
There is another aspect that hasn't been totally quantified, and that is that the growing season is now longer. And that's part of the global warming process. So you have a longer period, and you also have a warmer period. And so both of things are going to your point about you can have seasonal effects. I mean, this may turn out to be a frequent seasonal effect, but those are two more variables that have been added to the
plus salinity. It could just be,
And then
could be in effect because some years we've had very little, almost drought conditions in the summer.
But in the estuaries, I
Yeah.
think the salinity, I think all the data shows the salinity is pretty consistent, other than a specific rainstorm, which will change it for one tidal cycle.
We didn't see any eelgrass, right, Eric? I don't think. we
No,
saw any.
No. No.
Yeah.
No
At least not in that area, those areas we went to.
No.
Okay.
Any other reports?
Let me just correct one thing. I shouldn't have said demonstration project. What I meant was a rational phase of adaptive management.
Okay.
Okay.
The minutes will reflect.
That he meant rational phase of adaptive management.
All right. Okay, well, speaking of minutes, we have minutes of the prior meeting, August 31st and September 7th, which were sent around. Everybody's had a chance to look at them. Are there any amendments or additions or corrections?
I move that they be accepted as written.
All right, it's been moved and
I'll second.
seconded. They be accepted as written. All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? The ayes have it. We'll do that schedule for next month. Our usual is October 5th and October 19th. In this case, Mashpee, which couldn't meet with us today, would like to meet with us on the 19th. At Mashpee, as we planned before.
Which is our regular meeting.
Which is our regular
date.
meeting date. Brian House can come on the 19th, and so if it's okay with the committee, I'll tell them that the 19th will come visit.
I won't be here on the 19th.
Okay.
So the meeting on the 5th will be when? 3:30?
I
3:30?
actually don't believe I'll be here either,
On the 19th or the
of
5th?
October, the 19th.
The 19th.
Right.
Okay, well,
Well, that's actually okay, because we'll be meeting with them, and it'll be their meeting
their
more
meeting.
than
Yeah,
ours
right,
anyway.
right.
Okay,
Yeah, well,
But the 5th is at 3:30.
yes,
Yeah, I think the 8:30s are over.
are over, right?
Sailing season is winding down.
And Mashpee, 7:30? Or
7.
7?
7.
At the Mashpee Town Hall.
Yep.
Okay.
You mean the 19th?
On the
Yes.
19th.
All right, we'll figure out a carpool of
Yeah.
some sort.
Right.
Okay.
All right, any additional comments or corrections before we get into adjournment? Anything from Paul or Miriam? Okay.
I'll make a motion to adjourn.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? The ayes have it. We're out.